"Mason, stop," I whispered, my voice hoarse, almost choking. "You know we can't do this." But Mason didn't back away. He moved closer, step by step, as if each one was deliberate but carried an unstoppable determination. "Diana," he said, his voice low and trembling, "do you think I don't know this is wrong? But I can't. I can't stop." His words crushed my heart. I wanted to scream, to shatter the ever-shrinking distance between us, but every word stuck in my throat. Mason stood in front of me, too close, so close I could feel his warm breath against my skin. My heart pounded in my chest, so loud I feared he could hear it too. "You don't know how hard I've tried to keep my distance," Mason continued, his voice breaking. "But I can't pretend anymore, don't you see? You're all I think about, every day, every hour." "Mason, stop!" I almost shouted, but the sound came out weak and desperate. I stepped back, but the counter was behind me. I had nowhere left to go. "Don't you understand? We'll destroy everything. David is my husband. And you—" "I know what I am, Diana," Mason interrupted, his voice suddenly stronger, like a wave crashing through my feeble defenses. "But can you honestly say you don't feel the same? Can you tell me you've never thought about this, never wanted this?" I froze. His words stripped me bare, leaving me with no escape from the truth surrounding me. I couldn't answer, because to answer meant to admit that he was right, that I had crossed the line long ago and had refused to face it. Mason didn't wait for a reply. He leaned in, the gap between us shrinking to mere centimeters. My heart felt like it would explode as his lips brushed against mine. His kiss wasn't just longing, it was a battle, a storm of emotions too long suppressed now bursting free. I wanted to push him away, to tell him this was a mistake, but instead I kissed him back, weak, powerless, and completely lost in him. Then, a sudden noise broke the moment. The wind slammed the window shut, the sound like a jarring bell dragging me back to reality. I jolted, pushing Mason away forcefully. "No, Mason, no!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "We can't do this! Stop it now!" Mason stood frozen, his eyes filled with anguish. "Diana!" He tried to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Slowly he stepped back, his eyes never leaving mine. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing through the kitchen door. I collapsed onto the floor, burying my face in my hands, tears streaming uncontrollably. It felt like I'd just lost a part of myself. It wasn't just guilt or pain. It was the overwhelming sense that, from this moment on, I could never go back to who I was before. Everything had changed forever. After Mason left, I sat silently in the empty kitchen, my eyes staring blankly through the window now blurred by the flurries of white snow. Everything seemed frozen in time, except for the howling wind outside and the relentless pounding of my heart in my chest. How did things come to this? How did I, a woman who once prided herself on being in control, allow myself to be swept into an emotional whirlwind I couldn't escape? I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself. But the memories came rushing back like a flood, dragging me to the day I first met Mason, David's son from his previous marriage. David, the husband I deeply loved and respected. It was a crisp autumn evening when Mason walked into my life. David had asked me to prepare a lavish dinner to welcome Mason home. He explained that Mason had gone through a rough patch living alone in the city and decided to return home to find some peace. I still remember the moment Mason entered the house, tall, with slightly messy hair that partially obscured his sharp yet slightly timid eyes. He gave a reserved smile and shook my hand with a hesitance I couldn't help but notice. David introduced Mason with pride, emphasizing how important he was to him, and I smiled politely but maintained a certain distance. Being a stepmother was never part of my life plan, and the 12-year age gap between Mason and me made the role even more unfamiliar. At first, Mason barely acknowledged me. He was quiet, spending most of his time in his room or wandering around the farm with little interaction. I kept my distance, thinking it would make him more comfortable. But slowly, the walls of his aloofness began to crumble. One day, when David was away on a business trip, I noticed Mason struggling with the barn door that had jammed. I decided to bring him a glass of cold water, and that was the first time we had a conversation lasting more than a few minutes. "This door's always giving trouble," Mason muttered, his voice low and rough, his hands covered in dirt as he worked on the hinges. I stood nearby, watching him carefully adjust each screw. "I think it needs replacing." I nodded, unsure of what to say. Then Mason looked up, a faint smile crossing his face. "You're not what I expected." His words surprised me. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're easier to talk to than I thought," he replied, his eyes carrying an honesty that caught me off guard. "David's lucky to have you." That comment stayed with me. From that day forward, our conversations became more frequent. At first, they were just polite exchanges, but over time, we began sharing more. I told Mason about my life before meeting David, the dreams I once had, the hopes I had set aside in favor of a life I thought would be safe. Mason listened with a focus I rarely saw in anyone, not even David. He opened up as well. He spoke about his difficult childhood living with his biological mother, a woman he described as strong to the point of cruelty. He shared stories of endless arguments, of feeling abandoned when his mother chose her career and personal success over being present for her son. "David was the only person I could ever rely on," Mason admitted, his voice growing softer. "But even he doesn't always understand me." Those confessions drew me closer to Mason. I saw in him a lonely soul, searching for acceptance and love. And I, in my own way, had felt the same. While I loved David, his busy schedule, the long business trips, the endless hours at work, had left a void in my life. Mason, without meaning to, began to fill that emptiness in ways I didn't expect. I found myself looking forward to the little moments when Mason would step into the kitchen for a glass of water, or when he helped me clean up the backyard. I started noticing the small details about him, the way he pushed his hair back after working, the way his smile lit up his face when he laughed at my stories. I told myself it was just empathy, that I only wanted to help him through a tough time. But deep down, I knew I was treading dangerous waters. Those memories, each small, seemingly insignificant moment, had now become a storm of emotions swirling inside me. I couldn't pinpoint when I had gone wrong. Was it that first real conversation we had? Or was it when I realized I was eagerly awaiting his presence? One thing was clear. What I felt for Mason was something I should never have allowed, and the conflicting mix of longing and anguish tore me apart in ways I couldn't even begin to describe. In the days that followed, the atmosphere on the farm seemed to shift. Life went on as usual, the mornings filled with the sound of birds chirping and soft sunlight streaming through the windows, afternoons spent bustling around the kitchen or tidying up the house, and evenings when David returned home after long days of work. But everything now carried an unfamiliar weight, like a storm quietly gathering strength, waiting to unleash itself. Mason continued helping with the chores around the farm, but his gaze, the way he looked at me, had changed. It was no longer the look of a stepson toward his stepmother. Instead, it was something deeper, more intense, as though he were seeing through me, touching parts of myself I didn't dare acknowledge. And despite my efforts to ignore it, I couldn't deny the pull of that gaze. One afternoon, when David left early for a seminar in the city, I knew it would be just Mason and me for the rest of the day. I promised myself I would keep my distance, that nothing would cross the line. But that resolve started to fade when I stepped into the kitchen and saw Mason outside in the yard, fixing a fence that had been knocked loose by the wind. I brought him a glass of lemonade, as I often did. He looked up as I approached, his eyes glinting in the warm afternoon sunlight. "Thanks," he said, his voice rough yet familiar. "No problem," I replied, trying to keep my tone as casual as possible. But when my hand brushed against his as I handed him the glass, a jolt of electricity shot through me, and I instinctively pulled back. Mason seemed to feel it too. He said nothing, simply standing there, his gaze heavy with unspoken emotion. "Do you want to sit outside for a bit?" Mason asked suddenly, breaking the silence that hung between us. "It's too nice out to stay cooped up inside." I hesitated, but eventually nodded. We sat on an old wooden bench beneath the shade of a large tree. I held the glass of lemonade tightly, my hands trembling slightly. Mason didn't speak, but his presence made the air around us feel thick, almost suffocating. It was as if an invisible string was stretched taut between us, ready to snap at any moment. "Have you ever felt trapped?" Mason broke the silence, his eyes staring straight ahead, though his words were clearly meant for me. "Like everything around you is fine, but inside, you feel empty." His question caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond, but deep down, I understood the feeling he was describing. I nodded slightly, unable to meet his gaze. "Sometimes, but I tell myself things will get better." "What if they don't?" Mason turned to face me, his eyes burning with intensity. "What if we just keep living lives that don't belong to us, just because we think it's the right thing to do?" His words struck a nerve I didn't even know existed. I didn't know how to answer, afraid that any response would unravel the fragile control I was clinging to. "Mason, sometimes we have to do what's right, even if it's not easy," I whispered, my voice trembling as if I were trying to convince myself more than him. "But how do you know what's right?" he pressed, his voice low and rough, like a whisper carried by the wind. "What if the right thing is what hurts you the most? Is it still right?" I couldn't respond. I stared down at the glass of lemonade in my hands, feeling like words had lost all meaning. Just as I was about to stand up and walk away, Mason placed his hand gently over mine, stopping me. His touch was like fire, burning away the last threads of reason I was desperately holding on to. "Anna," he said softly, my name heavy with conflict. "Do you know how hard I've tried not to think about you? But I can't." I shot to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "Mason, don't," I interrupted, my voice shaky. "We can't. I can't." He stood as well, stepping closer until the space between us was nearly non-existent. I could feel his breath, warm against my skin. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked, his gaze piercing through every defense I had built. I don't know what happened next. All I remember is the distance between us disappearing in a moment of uncontrollable emotion. His lips met mine, gentle yet fierce, like he was holding on to something he knew he couldn't keep. For a second, I was lost, drowning in a sea of emotions I couldn't suppress. But then, a sudden sound shattered the moment, the front door creaking open in the distance. I jerked away, panic flooding every part of me. "No, we can't," I cried, my voice breaking. Mason stared at me, his eyes filled with pain and regret. "I'm sorry," he whispered before turning and walking away. I stood there, frozen, the bitter silence swallowing me whole. I knew in that moment everything had changed. There was no going back, and I had no idea how to move forward. After that afternoon, the atmosphere on the farm changed completely. A suffocating tension enveloped Mason and me, like a thick fog that couldn't be cleared. We avoided speaking, avoided looking at each other for too long, and stayed away from unnecessary interactions. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't suppress the storm of emotions swirling inside me. And I knew Mason felt the same. Every time we crossed paths by accident, I could feel his gaze linger on me, as if he wanted to say something but didn't have the courage to speak. I wasn't any different. My heart felt constricted, and whenever he was near, the air seemed heavier, making it hard to breathe. But I knew I couldn't let this continue. One morning, while David had left early to handle some business, I walked into the kitchen and saw Mason fixing one of the wooden chairs in the dining room. He worked quietly, not looking up as I entered. I stood there, unsure of what to say. The silence stretched between us like an invisible wall neither of us knew how to break. "Mason," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper, as if I feared any sound might shatter the fragile surface we were trying to maintain. He stopped working but didn't look up. "Yes," he replied, his voice low and colder than usual. "I think we need to talk," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "I can't take this silence anymore." Finally, he looked up, his eyes meeting mine. In his gaze I saw turmoil, pain, and regret. "So, what do you want to say?" he asked, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. I didn't know where to begin. I only knew that I needed to clear the air, to find a way out of this emotional spiral we were trapped in. "About what happened that day," I started, but my words faltered. I wasn't sure what to say next. "I'm sorry," I whispered, dropping my eyes. "I shouldn't have let things go that far." He was silent, his gaze fixed on me. "You don't need to apologize," he said, his voice strained with emotion. "If anyone should apologize, it's me. I crossed the line." "We were both wrong," I said, struggling to keep my composure. "But Mason, we can't let this go on. We have to stop this before it gets out of hand." He nodded, but I could see the pain in his eyes. "I know," he said, his voice catching. "But that doesn't mean I can stop feeling this way." His words made my heart ache. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that I was struggling with the same emotions, but I knew that saying so would only complicate things further. "Mason, you have to understand that I love David, and I don't want to hurt him. We can't destroy this family." "I know," he said, his voice filled with resignation, "and I'll do whatever you want, but you need to know that it's not easy for me." I nodded, feeling as though words were meaningless. "I understand," I whispered, then turned and walked away. But as I left the kitchen, I knew that it wouldn't be as simple as that. In the days that followed, Mason kept his distance even more. He no longer came into the kitchen while I was cooking, nor did he stay to chat, even about trivial things. He spent most of his time outdoors or in the barn, busying himself with tasks I wasn't sure were truly necessary. Even though he avoided me, I could still feel his gaze from afar, as if he was trying to keep me in his sight without daring to come closer. David seemed oblivious to the changes. He was cheerful with his work, still giving me warm smiles and hugs when he came home. But every time he looked at me with love and trust in his eyes, I felt like a fraud, unworthy of the devotion he gave me. One afternoon, while David was out meeting a client, I sat alone in the living room, trying to focus on a book in my hands. But then I heard Mason's footsteps in the hallway pulling me out of the pages. He entered the room, standing in the doorway, his eyes locking with mine. I knew then that we couldn't keep living like this. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low but determined. I nodded, setting the book down. He sat across from me, his hands clenched tightly, as if trying to hold himself together. "I'm going to leave," he said, and his words made my heart stop. "Mason, you don't have to," I began, but he cut me off. "I can't stay here anymore," he said, his voice resolute. "Every day I'm here, I feel like I'm destroying your life, David's life, and my own." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I didn't know what to say. I knew he was right. I knew his leaving was the best thing for all of us, but I didn't want to lose him. "Mason, I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you, but I understand. You need to do this." He nodded, his eyes filled with a sadness that ran deep. "Thank you," he said before standing up and leaving. I sat there, feeling as though my world was collapsing around me. But I knew this change was necessary. It was the only way to salvage what was left. After months of tension and heartbreak, I came to understand that Mason's departure was not only the best thing for him, but also the only escape for all of us. Sitting alone in the quiet house, I felt the emptiness he left behind like a deep wound. But I also knew that this was my chance to right my wrongs, to rediscover the person who had once vowed to love and honor David, the husband I had so unfairly hurt. The morning Mason left was dreary, as if the sky itself shared in our goodbye. I stood silently by the window, watching him pack his belongings into his car. His eyes never left the ground, his shoulders heavy with the weight of emotions he couldn't put into words. I wanted to step outside, to tell him that I hoped he would find happiness and peace. But my feet refused to move, and I knew the best thing I could do for him was to let him go without a word, without a moment of weakness. As Mason prepared to get into the car, he looked up toward the window where I stood. Our eyes met for a fleeting but profound moment that felt like time had stopped. He gave me a faint smile, sad but resolute, as if to say he understood and accepted it. I nodded, tears streaming down my face, but I didn't wipe them away. That was my farewell to him, my way of letting go so that we could both move forward. As his car disappeared down the dirt road, I sank into a chair, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions. I knew this marked the end of a chapter, but I also knew the memories and feelings tied to Mason would never completely fade. He had come into my life and illuminated the voids I hadn't realized were there. But he also left me with a valuable lesson, that love is not just about feelings. It's about responsibility, choices, and commitment to what truly matters. That evening, David returned home after a long day at work. He entered the house, his laughter filling the space as he shared stories about his day. I listened, trying to reconnect with the man I had promised to share my life with. Deep down, I knew I needed to take steps to mend the trust and love I had jeopardized. "David," I said, interrupting him mid-sentence. He turned to me, his eyes gentle and full of trust I didn't deserve. "I'm sorry for not being the wife I should have been. I promise I'll do better." He looked at me, surprised at first, but then he smiled and took my hand. "Anna, I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be you. And if there's ever anything that troubles you or makes you feel weary, I hope you'll always share it with me." His words felt like a second chance. I squeezed his hand, vowing to myself that from this point forward, I would do everything I could to protect our marriage and never repeat the mistakes of the past. In the days that followed, I focused on rebuilding my relationship with David. I spent more time with him, listened to him more attentively, and rediscovered the small joys of marriage that I had once taken for granted. David, ever the devoted husband, never asked about my sudden change, but I knew he sensed the difference, and that made me love him even more. Mason remained a part of my memories. Sometimes I wondered where he was, whether he had found the peace he so deserved. I hoped he had begun a new life, unburdened by the emotions that had tied us together in such a painful way. I no longer wished to see him again because I knew that keeping him in the past was the only way for me to move forward. Life is never perfect, and neither is love. But through trials and mistakes, I learned to cherish what I have, to love more deeply, and to safeguard what truly matters. Mason came and went like a storm, but that storm left behind a lesson that helped me understand myself and what I needed to do to become the woman and wife I aspired to be. And though the memories of him linger, I know I made the right choice. I chose to stay. I chose to love. And I chose to begin again.